Word nerd, wordsmith, wordy, wordless. Oxford Dictionary says a word is a single, distinct, meaningful element of speech or writing, used with others or sometimes alone. We say each one matters. No extra words is literature, minimalist style. And we're getting you right to the story. Sights. When it became clear that there was no end in sight to the political unrest, they consolidated the program and sent most volunteers home. The handful of us who stayed on were encouraged to take advantage of all the five-star restaurants starving for business and national parks offering local rates until they could assign us new sites. After 2 years in country, though, it felt strange to explore those sites meant for tourists, and at the world's most famous waterfall we ditched the tour to swim in a natural pool off to the side, which despite the alarming chill of the water offered us such a peaceful view that we could almost ignore the sound of things crashing down. At one lodge, we were the only 3 patrons, and for a week a guide drove us around the grounds in the morning and got drunk with us at night. I'm not sure if he was more humored or depressed that none of us had cameras, but he would let us look through his rifle to glimpse a leopard in a tree, or close-up of wildebeest on the other side of the watering hole. It was strange to look through his telescopic sight, to see not just a lone buffalo in the distance, but where a bullet would rip through his spine. Sounds. Because I've only come in for an oil change, when he mentions something about needing new pads, it sounds like he's trying to pad the bill. "The art isn't hiding the art," said Horace, and he leaves me to consider my options, sits down behind his desk with an apple and a book of puzzles. I wonder if his take-it-or-leave-it approach is part of his pitch, if he's aware of my wariness, or simply tired of sound advice falling on deaf ears. Once the car is up on the lift, he asks about the last time I replaced my struts, and as I hear myself respond, I'm struck by the swagger in my voice, like a high school kid trying to mask his difference as indifference, the sudden hoarseness in the back of my throat, exuding not confidence, but the sound of it. "Hear that whir?" he says, revving the engine, and I nod my head as though I could tell a whir from a hiss. "Alternator," he says, lifting his eyebrows. But I don't have it in me to go back and forth anymore in this language that I don't speak, to try to distinguish sounds from meaningless noise. Pitches. Unlike the driving range and those gratifying blasts off the tee, the local pitch and putt offered the tempered pleasures of the short game, demanded the finesse of lofting a ball in the air without overshooting the hole, the attentiveness to exact distances, and strokes of precision. This, of course, is probably why we used to descend upon the back nine come late night, chug a can of cheap beer, then somersault down those small hills. We wanted to tumble aimlessly in the pitch black until we felt lost, wanted to redefine that course where the rough referred to uncut grass, hazards to sand and water, and every hole was a par 3. One time, we even built a bonfire in a bunker, pitched a tent, and spent the night on hole 6. It didn't matter that it ended up raining before we roasted our marshmallows, or that our tents were old and provided flimsy protection at best. We took such pleasure in driving our stakes through that artificial ground. Hello there, welcome to No Extra Words, the Flash Fiction podcast. My name is Chris Baker-Dersch. I'm your producer and editor. Every now and then, something lands in my submissions file where I think, man, if somebody had not done that so well, it could have been complete disaster. And so I hope that people are inspired to emulate but not copy. And that is so much the case with Ben Berman's trio of short stories that started us out, Sights, Sounds, Pitches. When Ben sent these to me, he sent them in that exact order, and he said, like any great writer doing submissions, please use these however you can and if you can, but they're kind of meant to work as a trio. And as soon as I read them, I thought, of course they work as a trio. They reminded me of when I am not talking into this microphone, I sing in a community choir. And right now, we, as all great community choirs are doing, we are getting ready for Christmas. Have been getting ready for Christmas since August. So those of you musicians in the house, I feel your pain. Christmas for us musicians starts in mid-August and ends December 23rd this year is our last performance. So one of the selections we are working on in my choir right now is a Christmas cantata, which, shameless plug and self-promotion, we are going to debut along with a festival choir of about 300 singers at Carnegie Hall in New York City the Friday after Thanksgiving. So this piece is debuting, being conducted by the composer John Levitt. So anyone who happens to be in the hearing of my voice who's going to be in the New York City metropolitan area Thanksgiving weekend, it's Friday, November 25th at Carnegie Hall in New York City. We're debuting this piece. Anyway, shameless plug of my own projects, but we are working on a Christmas cantata. So it is, I think, 6 individual pieces of music that tie together. So they are meant to be performed in sequence with no real break in between. And when you perform them for an audience that's used to seeing this kind of music, they know not to applaud, not to break between pieces. And so there is a pause. The accompanist will stop and start the new, in this case, the orchestra, being accompanied by orchestra, will stop and start the new piece of music, but they are designed to live right next to each other and to flow into each other, although they are completely separate pieces of music and completely unrelated. And I feel that way about sight, sounds, and pitches. You go to these 3 different spots, and you don't know if you're following the same character or a different character, but it takes you on this journey where each story is a completely separate entity and they don't reference each other, but linguistically and thematically they lead you through on this journey. And I said to Ben, I want them, and I want all 3 of them, and I want to do them in order with no breaks. And so that's how we started you off today. And in thinking about building an episode around that, I wanted to kind of do a larger, almost symphony of everyday life kind of stories. And so you have 2 more that have this same kind of sensory about them that we started out with. We are going to move on to God Awful by Robert Carnahan, which is voiced for us by Ryan Spence, which is a sort of an everyday moment that is meant to attack your senses. And then we are going to close with The Suburbs by Jason Heru in the same general theme. And so when you're listening to these stories today, that's really how I want you to think of them, is as a symphony with movements. And each one is separate, and each one is telling you its own story, but each one is designed to take you on a journey of mood. They're connected together in this very intentional way. So today is the musician in me who has never written a piece of music in my life, attempting to write my own symphony through short stories. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I will see you next week here on No Extra Words.
I sat on the greenish, plastic-feeling, fake leather seats of the diner booth and leaned heavily on the table. I hunched forward and tried to blink moisture into my dry, unrested eyes. It took all of the energy I could muster to hold my body up with my elbows. I breathed heavily, trying to stifle a yawn with every breath. It truly was ours o'clock in the morning, and apparently the only time this meeting could possibly be held. I stared off into the distance, and my jaw hung slackly as I tuned out the world around me. Every time I blinked, I felt a glimpse of paradise, as I wished I could fall into a deep sleep. "Excuse me," a voice croaked from beside me. I mumbled, as I inhaled suddenly through my nose, straightened up and looked toward the waitress who had suddenly appeared before me. She was a portly woman with short gray hair and a rough, gravelly voice. She sounded like she'd been chain-smoking for the better part of her life. She had a pad and pencil in her hand and would have had a cigarette permanently drooping from her lips if it were still legal in public places. She looked like a stereotype that existed only in classic cinema diners, and she was the only person who wanted to be there less than I did. "We're gonna get you, sweetie," she asked. I thought for a moment. It was too early for me to have an appetite. I needed something to wake me up. Maybe if I was conscious, the meeting would go well. "Coffee, please," I muttered. "Anything else?" she croaked. "No." I sighed and went back to staring forward into nothingness. She grunted as she left to fetch the coffee. She returned mere moments later with a fresh steaming pot. I almost smiled as she set the cup down with a clunk and began to pour that delicious dark liquid into it. Oh, what a fool I was. She left the table and I began one of the most harrowing journeys of my life. I picked up the cup of coffee, expecting to smell that delicious aroma I'm so familiar with. Instead, I inhaled and my nose was assaulted with an atrocious, acidic scent. I gagged slightly and looked down at the drink. What had I got myself into? I braced myself and tried to take a sip. Normally I can handle black coffee. I almost spat this slop all over the table. It was the worst thing my tongue had ever been abused by. It tasted burnt. It tasted stale. It tasted like the hot, wet anus of Satan himself. I set the drink down and stared at it for a moment. Normally I would enjoy a black cup of coffee, as I treated myself to its sweet bouquet and delectable flavors. I would never sully such a beautiful drink with anything as crass as cream and sugar. This time I had no choice. I needed this coffee. I needed to wake myself up. I had to do it. I took a creamer and 2 packets of sugar and poured them into the coffee. I took a spoon from the table and stirred it up. I tried it again. Well, it was still awful. It was the same burnt flavor with a slight bit of dulcitude on the back end. I sighed and poured in 4 more packets of sugar. I dumped another creamer in. I took a deep breath and tried again. I don't know if I could refer to it as palatable, but it was better. No, not better. It was less revolting. It was still quite revolting, though. I decided the only way to get this caffeine into my system was to guzzle the atrocious liquid and just get the whole mess over with. So I did just that. I put the cup up to my lips, took a deep breath, and chugged the hot offensive mess as fast as I could. It dripped down my chin as I finished it as fast as I possibly could. I wiped the mess off of my face with my sleeve and sighed. It was awful, but at least it was over. The waitress approached with the pot of coffee once again. "How was the coffee?" she asked. "It was fine, thank you," I answered. "You want another cup, sweetheart?" she croaked. Sure," I said. "Thank you." She poured another cup of coffee and walked away. I stared into it and sighed.
The Suburbs by Jason Haru. The problem is, in the suburbs where we live, all our houses look the same, with the same basketball nets above the garage doors, the same basketballs lying in the grass. The problem is so bad, sometimes when my neighbor and I get together to watch the big game, it's hard to tell whose basement we're in. Are we in my basement or his basement? Jesus. It got worse, the problem, because every morning on the way to work, I never knew if I'd end up at my job or my neighbor's job. And the most stressful part was I had no idea what my neighbor did for a living, so I wasn't even properly trained. And they eventually had to let me go, which I understand. And I don't blame them for that. I would have done the same. But the problem was, even after they let me go, I wasn't sure if I'd lost my job or my neighbor's job. And when I told my wife about it, bearing my soul, she had no idea how I felt because I accidentally told my neighbor's wife by mistake, and my neighbor's wife didn't care. Why should she? The problem got so bad, I broke down and wept. And my neighbor did too. But Jesus, after crying, we asked each other what was wrong, and neither one of us knew. Thanks for listening to the No Extra Words podcast. For more information on today's stories and contributors, or to learn how to submit your own work, please visit us at noextrawords.wordpress.com. The best support you can give the show is to recommend us to your family and friends. See you next time.